everyone. Welcome to another episode of Live with NORML. Today is going to be a special episode. Of course, I'm Pedini, Development Director here at the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. It's Friday, December 19th. You know what we're going to do, friends? We're going to try our best to answer all of your burning questions about marijuana rescheduling live. Let's get into it. Hey, take a quick second wherever you're watching. Go ahead and hit that like button, that follow button, that subscribe button. You might think you're following NORML. Let's go ahead and check and make sure you are. And share this with your audience so that we can reach more people just like you who are dedicated to ending marijuana prohibition in the United States. Hey, frogs, good to see you. Friends, take a second and drop a note in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know what your questions are about marijuana rescheduling. I'm going to say hi to some of you. Then I'm going to bring in our special guest. Let's see who's here with us. Frogs, of course you're here. You were first today. Welcome, welcome. Hey, OG Grandma, welcome back, friend. Hey, Chris. Good to see you. Hey, John in California. Hey, Brian. Hey, Jason. Hey, Fried Mouse. Welcome back. Yeah, Brian, long time no see. Hey, Ellie. Ellie's our advocate of the week, 100%. Good to see you, friend. Hey, Lana. Look at everyone over there on Instagram. Hey, TP in North Chesterfield. Hey, KJ. Sheena in Collinsville. Hey, Bernie. Hi, Callie in Arizona, and Only One Real Meat in Springfield. All right, we got a lot of the nation covered today, friends. Ron in Indianapolis, Michigan, Pennsylvania just joined. Richard in Detroit. Hey, Alan. Hey, Insulin. Hey, Carlita. And John, welcome back. Hey, Jim. This is going to be a great show. There are so many of you here today. I have to get Paul in here with me. Paul, welcome back. Oh no, you're muted.
Feels like if it was a Friday in a 9-day week, not a 7-day.
This week has been 6 months long. Yesterday was 3 years long. Let's talk about rescheduling some more. And look, I'm glad that we finally have that announcement behind us. Now we can get back into talking to people about what this really means, because I know it's been a lot for you also to see some of the reporting around this issue and how people are talking about it. And there seem to be a lot of misconceptions about what federal marijuana rescheduling means for state policies, for federal policies, and what the actual process looks like and how long it will take. And we're going to dive back into all of that again today. If you all watching have questions, drop those in the comments for us, and we will talk about it. Yes, Insulin, we're going to talk about that executive order first. So, of course, everyone should know by now that yesterday, President Trump signed an executive order directing his administration to take action on marijuana rescheduling, the process that was initiated under former President Biden. Paul, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I see folks have lots of questions in the comments section. We will definitely get to those. Ideally, JM and I may answer some of the questions as we have this discussion right now, but certainly when we've hit sort of the most significant points, if people still have questions, I'll be happy to answer any of them. The way I sort of proposed this ahead of the show when JM and I were talking was to sort of break this down into 3 parts. Like, first, we're going to discuss exactly what happened yesterday. Then we're going to discuss the timeline with which these directives are under. And then we can really dive into what are the implications? What would rescheduling do? What won't rescheduling do? And I think that's really sort of the best way to approach this really complex and complicated issue. So to begin, what happened yesterday? Well, at 1:30, the president held a press conference, and he was joined by representatives from the Centers for Medicare, from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, from the FDA. He was surrounded by patients, surrounded by doctors, and he signed an executive order directing the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to move forward and complete a Biden-era recommendation to move cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. That was the extent of the executive order. In addition, during the press conference, he had the head of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid announce a provisional program to start next year where seniors enrolled in Medicaid who are using certain regulated CBD products could seek and receive reimbursement for the cost of those products up to $500 a year. In addition, he also announced that White House staff would be working with Congress to ensure going forward that patients who have been reliant on hemp-derived cannabinoid products like CBD-based products would continue to have access to those products. So clearly, there has been a message received by the White House that there is concern that the congressional action in November rolling back access to some of these products may go too far. And there seemed to be a recognition that Congress may need to step in, revisit that issue, and potentially clarify that issue and expand access so that they don't inadvertently cut off patients' access to products that many of them are already reliant on. So those are really the three key points of what happened yesterday. There was the executive order, and then there were two additional policy announcements in addition to that executive order.
Well, let's talk about, I want to talk about a little bit more about the executive order directing his administration to take action.
Sure.
And as opposed to what we're seeing. We're seeing marijuana has been rescheduled.
Right. Yeah, so then we get into the timeline issue. Mm-hmm. So again, two separate issues here. With respect to the pilot program that was announced with respect to CBD products and Medicare, it was announced that that pathway would begin as soon as April 1st, 2026. So theoretically, in the first quarter of next year, patients could begin using these products and receiving federal reimbursement for these products. Again, that's separate from the executive order. Now, let's get to the executive order with regard to rescheduling. As everyone should know, rescheduling is a process. It's not something that can be unilaterally done by the president, and the president does not possess the unilateral authority to, on his or her own, reschedule or reclassify marijuana. In 2022, the Biden administration initiated this current administrative petition to reclassify cannabis. Under the guise of that petition, the Department of Health and Human Services was directed to conduct a thorough review of the data concerning cannabis's safety profile and its therapeutic efficacy. And in 2023, HHS came back with a recommendation that based on their review, cannabis did not meet the criteria of a Schedule 1 controlled substance. Further, HHS said that cannabis possessed legitimate medical value and that its safety profile showed that it was safer than Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 controlled substances. Therefore, HHS recommended it be moved to Schedule 3. Okay, that's where we were in 2023. In 2024, the DEA, which under this process has significant influence in determining the outcome, they looked at HHS's recommendation and they clearly disagreed with it. And they asked for administrative hearings before their own judge to take place, where participants could argue in favor of the recommendation and against the recommendation. Those hearings were set to begin in January. They never took place. And there's been an impasse in this process ever since. So what Trump did yesterday was he ordered the Attorney General, who by federal statute possesses the power to advance this process. He ordered the Attorney General to use that statutory power to reconvene this process, to expedite and complete the recommendation that was first issued by HHS in 2023. Now, if and when the U.S. Attorney General moves forward and finalizes a rule that says formally we are asking for cannabis to be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, that rule then has to be published in the Federal Register. That is yet another stage in this ongoing process. It's not the end of the process. And I want to make that clear. Trump's executive order isn't the end of the process. The Attorney General formally asking for cannabis to be reclassified, that's not the end of the process. The formal publication of the rule, that is not the end of the process. Because once that rule is published, there is a period of judicial review that I believe as a layperson, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert in federal regulations, but I believe is a 60-day window. And during that window, interested parties with standing in this issue can legally challenge the rule. They can argue the rule is arbitrary and capricious. And if a federal judge believes that these parties have standing and that their arguments have merit, that judge can order hearings or court proceedings to further litigate the matter. If that happens, while those court proceedings are taking place, the formal rule change does not take effect. So in other words, cannabis remains Schedule 1 until this process is resolved. Even when the formal rule is issued by the U.S. Attorney General, cannabis is still in Schedule 1. If the rule change is challenged while that litigation goes forward, cannabis still remains in Schedule 1. And not surprisingly, within hours of Trump signing this executive order, there were prohibitionist organizations who were publicly stating they had retained legal counsel to challenge this rule. In addition, I'm sure many folks saw today that the state attorney generals from a number of different states, Wyoming, Idaho, Nebraska, Indiana, Kansas, Louisiana, they also all indicated that they intend to push back against and also could potentially legally challenge this rule. So what that means for folks out there as far as a timeline goes is that cannabis has not yet been rescheduled, and it will not be rescheduled until a final rule is published, until at least 60 days have passed since the publication of that rule, and until any legal challenges to that rule have been resolved. So it still actually could be quite some time before we see this rule implemented, if it's implemented at all.
Paul, OG Grandma, has a quick point of clarity here and asks, is it 30 days or 60 days?
I believe it's 60 days, but again, as I said, I am not a legal expert on this. I've seen both different timelines provided by different sources.
All right. Well, maybe we'll find that out together before our next show on this. All right. I'm looking to see where I want to go next because we talked about the timeline, which I think is important. I really appreciate that you hopefully drove home for everyone that rescheduling has not yet occurred. This is just a reigniting of
another step in an ongoing process.
And we've been through numerous rescheduling petitions before.
Yes.
Some of which
I know folks don't like me necessarily to bring it up, but there was a rescheduling petition that was initially filed by NORML back in the 1970s. From the time it was filed till the time it was resolved was 18 years. So that provides some perspective of how long this process can drag out from start to finish. I get it. This process is already 3 years in. That seems like a really long time for a lot of folks, and it is. But this is a process that was designed to take a very long time. On average, previous rescheduling petitions have generally took about 5 to 6 years to be resolved.
Wow. Well, we're 3 years into 2 years into this one. Two quick things I'm going to touch on here. Hey, Fred, I see your question. Has any other president done this? Signed an order to reschedule? No other president has done this. And this isn't the way that rescheduling or this sort of process really is intended to play out, not by executive order.
No, it isn't. But I can see the reason for doing so, because absent this executive order, as I said earlier, the process had came to a standstill. There seemed to be no indication, certainly on the part of the DEA, to advance this process any further. And so absent the president taking action, I don't think we would see on her own the attorney general intervene. I don't think we would have seen the DEA make any effort to reconvene hearings or to move this process forward. So I commend the president for stepping in and saying, hey, look, this has been a standstill long enough. This process is dragged out too long already. Let's see if he can do what he can to move it along as best he can. Yeah,
let's see. Hashaholic is watching on Instagram, and this is not a question that is new. We've seen this a few times before. It's an easy one for us to answer. Hashaholic wants to know if home cultivation, is that dead now with this? And no, it's not. This ties pretty nicely into another question here. Zach asks, rescheduling, does it affect the individual state's ability to govern their own rulings? No. And Paul, I think you probably have a little bit more to add to that about what it would do at the state level and what it wouldn't do.
Sure. So there's a lot to answering that question. And there's some things we definitively know, and there's some things that we think we might know. And the reason I add that caveat is because this is unprecedented territory if and when this rescheduling action goes through. We've never had a controlled substance be moved out of Schedule 1 into a different classification by any sort of executive action. And I'm not sure that historically there's ever even been an administrative rescheduling petition to move a drug from one class to another that's been successful. Certainly, we've never had a substance classified as a Schedule 2, 3, 4, or 5 controlled substance that lacked FDA approval, as cannabis currently does. So if and when marijuana is moved to Schedule 3, absent FDA approval, that will be an unprecedented and very unique situation. It will also potentially be a very complicated situation because the Schedule 3 regulations are generally designed to regulate pharmaceutical FDA-approved substances, of which cannabis is not. So most of those regulations would be totally inapplicable. So again, there's a lot here to unwrap. let's say a few things that I think we can be pretty certain of. One, this is the first significant change in the federal government's posture when it comes to cannabis in over 5 decades. This is a long overdue acknowledgement from the federal government that marijuana has legitimate medical value. In fact, prior to Trump signing his executive order, he stated that the evidence has compelled the federal government to take this next step. I think that's actually a pretty powerful statement. As I said to many media outlets yesterday, it was only about 15 years ago where the federal government wasn't only denying that cannabis had medical value, it was actually threatening to take away the medical licensure of physicians who recommended medical marijuana to their patients. That's how hostile the administration was to the idea that cannabis had therapeutic value. So this is a significant shift in the federal government's position. I think it's an important shift because I do think it is going to ultimately change the narrative. It is going to be increasingly difficult for folks on the other ideological spectrum of this issue to continue to try and deny cannabis has legitimate medical utility. When the majority of states recognize marijuana as a medicine, the majority of the public recognizes marijuana as a medicine, the majority of practicing physicians recommend marijuana is a medicine, the National Academy of Sciences recommend that marijuana is a medicine, the Department of Health and Human Services of now 2 administrations say marijuana is a medicine, and we have the White House saying it too. So again, that's a powerful statement. I think it changes the conversation going forward. I also think that we are going to see a number of folks within the Republican Party who historically have been either reluctant to move on this issue or outright hostile to this issue begin to revisit their position, particularly when it comes to medical cannabis. We have seen historically that Trump is not afraid to publicly take positions that are inconsistent with the positions of most in his party. And when he does, it's not Trump who later changes his position. It's the party that they evolve their position to be more aligned with Trump. So I think that's going to happen here as well. I think that has significant implications for those out there who live in some of these GOP-led states that have thus far been hostile to the issue of marijuana policy reform, including medical cannabis reform. I'm thinking about states like Indiana and a few others where Republican leaders have literally said they're not willing to move this issue because it is in conflict with federal policy. Well, they can't say that going forward. The administration's been clear that they think marijuana is a medicine and they think federal marijuana policy needs to be reformed. We also can presume that if this change goes forward, it's going to provide tax fairness to state licensed marijuana businesses. Right now, these businesses face artificially high costs because they're not able to deduct standard business expenses and take other standard tax deductions because cannabis is Schedule 1. By leveling the playing field, by treating these businesses, not giving them an exception to the rule, but simply by treating them like every other business, that is going to bring these entities' costs down. Those costs right now, these higher costs, the high cost of these businesses to do business is, of course, passed on to the consumer. Our hope is, of course, as these costs fall, because tax fairness is now being provided to them, those lower costs will then be passed on to the consumer, resulting in lower prices for retail cannabis products. I think that's going to be a benefit. Now, there's a number of other changes that a lot of folks aren't talking about that I think are going to be in play if and when rescheduling becomes law. First of all, there are a number of states that have trigger laws on the books. What that means is they have a law in the books that says if and when the federal government changes its marijuana policy, this state needs to revisit its own marijuana policies. That doesn't mean the state automatically has to change its policies to align with the federal government, but it does trigger a review of those policies. And that certainly might encourage, again, some of these states, some of these holdout states, to change their posture when it comes to cannabis criminalization. Right now, if you're a patient and you are in the Veterans Administration, as you know, you cannot receive a recommendation, a formal recommendation for medical marijuana from your VA physician, regardless of whether or not you live in a medical cannabis state, because federal rules and regulations say that VA doctors cannot recommend a Schedule I controlled substance. Okay, the regulation doesn't say cannabis. It says a Schedule I controlled substance. So if cannabis is no longer Schedule I, theoretically, that prohibition, that restriction on VA doctors goes away. That should increase access to medical patients in legal states who are in the VA system. There's a number of other federal restrictions that aren't specific to cannabis per se, but are specific to Schedule I controlled substances. Like, for instance, one can lose their subsidized or federally assisted housing if they use a Schedule I controlled substance. Not marijuana per se, but a Schedule I controlled substance. Again, if cannabis is no longer Schedule I, theoretically that restriction goes away. That same sort of restriction exists right now for gun ownership. Again, the federal government since 1968 has said that anyone who uses cannabis is a, quote, unlawful user of a controlled substance. And therefore, not only can they not own a firearm legally or ammunition, they face federal prosecution for doing so. The government's entire premise that marijuana consumers are unlawful drug users rests on the fact that cannabis is Schedule I. If cannabis is no longer Schedule I, again, I don't think there is a solid legal ground for the federal government to continue to make that argument. And you know what? Just today, the gun rights group, Gun Owners of America, came out and they made that same argument as well. There's potential impacts on federal drug testing guidelines. This is something we haven't talked about very much, but other groups who are in this space really care about this issue. I was on a webinar earlier this week with the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association. Their representative said in no uncertain terms, if cannabis is moved to Schedule III, absent other congressional legislative action, that federal drug testing guidelines will no longer continue testing people for marijuana. Again, if I'm taking them at their word, and they seemed awfully sincere in this position, that is another potential significant change that may take place with regard to federal policy. So there is a lot of issues that are in play here. This isn't just symbolic. It is significant. Yes, it doesn't legalize cannabis nationwide. It doesn't harmonize the marijuana laws of the majority of US states with federal policy. It doesn't do those things. But that is not to say it doesn't have significant changes. And that is not to say that this, again, doesn't reflect a significant change in the federal government's stance when it comes to cannabis and cannabis policy.
Huge, huge, huge. And Paul, I know we've already touched on this a few times during today's show, but the comments keep coming. My friend, let's talk about this idea, this notion that if marijuana is reclassified as a Schedule III drug, that is handing it over to Big Pharma, that is going to force existing operators to get pharmacy licenses.
Yeah.
It's going to, deconstruct the entire regulated cannabis structure in every single state. We know this isn't true. We've talked about this a lot. Let's talk about it again.
Sure. So when HHS made its recommendation in 2023, they preemptively addressed this issue. They said, to be clear, we're recommending cannabis be moved to Schedule 3 because we believe it has accepted medical utility in the United States. I use that phrase because that is the phrase that is in the criteria of this Controlled Substances Act. If a drug has accepted medical utility in the United States, by definition, by statute, it cannot be Schedule 1. It has to be placed in a different schedule, or it needs to be removed from the CSA altogether. Some folks like to conflate accepted medical utility with FDA approval. But if you read the HHS recommendation, and if you read the White House legal counsel opinion that was issued in conjunction with HHS's recommendation, they said these two things cannot be conflated. FDA approval is an entirely different process. This is not part of that process, and we're simply acknowledging that there is sufficient evidence that cannabis has medical utility. We are not saying that it is an FDA-approved substance. We don't have the power to say it's an FDA-approved substance. Only the FDA has the power to do that. And only the FDA does that when a specific entity comes to them with the dossier of phase 3 clinical trial data and asks the FDA to review that data for the purpose of bringing a particular substance to market to treat a specific patient population. That process is not happening. The FDA approval process does not lend itself to the approval of raw, crude botanical substances. There are no pharmaceutical companies that are trying to develop the marijuana plant to go through the FDA approval process. Hell, there's only 3 licensed federal growers of marijuana in the United States. None of them are pharmaceutical companies. So there doesn't even right now exist a pathway for pharmaceuticals to bring marijuana to market through the traditional FDA approval process. So moving cannabis to Schedule 3 does not change that reality. In fact, I would dare say that if there was ever or had ever been a window for pharmaceutical manufacturers to try to get into the marijuana business, it was with hemp between 2018 and today, because hemp-derived products were thoroughly descheduled by the federal government. One could have engaged in product development with hemp-derived cannabinoid products without needing a federal license, and one could have gone through that entire clinical trial process and tried to bring hemp-derived products to market under the FDA auspices, and nobody tried to do that.
Well, I can't wait to answer this question 7,000 times more, probably before the end of the show. But no, to everyone who has asked, I see you, Moynihan Law Office. That is correct. Confirming that without FDA approval, medical cannabis sales at state licensed dispensaries should have no impact other than be able, hopefully, to deduct expenses.
Yes, it's a much more concise way of saying what I was trying to say. But yes, this is moving cannabis to Schedule 3 does not equate FDA approval. Absent FDA approval, the federal rules and regulations that apply to prescription FDA-approved drugs will still not apply to cannabis.
I love it. Yep. So no, this doesn't mandate that cannabis products will be distributed and sold solely in pharmacies. It doesn't make it an FDA-approved drug. And again, as Paula said, this rescheduling is about the plant itself, botanical cannabis. The FDA is not in the business of regulating plants. and this plant is not going to fit into the FDA drug approval process because it's a plant. Paul, let's talk about research. Oh, the other one that we've had to I'll tell you, when I was watching that signing ceremony with the president yesterday on YouTube, and just watching clinician after clinician, people who put MD at the end of their name, who you think would know better, but can't be bothered to know better, stand up there and say, oh, it's gonna expand research. We're finally gonna be able to do research on the marijuanas.
Yeah.
Find out what it's good for and how terrible it is. It was mind-boggling watching that. But as you and I talked about, I did appreciate Nora's very specific choice of the word accelerate, because she's probably the only person who was anywhere close to correct in discussing what it actually does for research.
Right. And you know what, JM, now might be a good time in the comments section to put up the link for our facts versus myths.
I will pop that right back up.
With regard to what rescheduling does and what rescheduling doesn't do, because we do have a whole section on what it does and doesn't do as it pertains to research.
There it is. It's either over Paul's head or over my head, depending on where you're watching. You can scan this QR code and it will take you to the document, to our the article Paul published yesterday, the day before, about getting the facts versus myths of rescheduling. All the things we're talking about today are in this document, in this article on our website, and you can scan that QR code and it'll take you right there. Continue, Paul.
Yeah. So, first of all, the term research is a loaded term. It's basically meaningless to say research, because as anyone knows who reads our blog or gets the NORML weekly news, we have unprecedented amount of research, of scientific papers specific to cannabis, its mechanism of action, and its effects. Okay, there is no lack of research right now. We've had over 37,000 peer-reviewed scientific published papers specific to the cannabis plant in just the last decade. We'll have 4,500 more papers, specific papers to cannabis and its effects, published in the scientific literature this year. So this isn't a matter of we don't know enough about cannabis because nobody's done the research. We have research coming out about cannabis every single day. Oh,
but Paul, what about the gold standard, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials?
Right.
What about
much of the research that we have about cannabis falls in the category of what we call observational trials. So these are trials that are set up where researchers have a particular question about cannabis and its effects. So they recruit individuals who self-identify as cannabis users, and they study them. They observe them over time to see what effects cannabis may or may not have upon that population. Sometimes these are longitudinal observational trials, which means that researchers study this patient population or this general population for many, many years. In other cases, they're case control observational trials. In that instance, researchers have folks that are self-identified marijuana users, and then they have a control group, matched individuals who aren't marijuana users, and they see if there's similarities and differences between the two groups over time, and they try to assert whether marijuana may be the variable that's responsible for those differences. So that's the way most research is done when it comes to cannabis, and that's how we largely learn about the impact of cannabis. Now, before somebody turns around and says, well, you can't necessarily definitively prove causation through observational trials, that's true. But we rely on observational trials all the time. The reason, for instance, we know that the longer people smoke cigarettes, the higher their risk of lung cancer becomes, isn't because we did placebo-controlled randomized clinical trials on tobacco smoking. It's because we have decades of observational trials and case control observational research assessing people who smoke tobacco versus people who don't smoke tobacco and assessing the similarities and differences over time. That is a very valid form of research. Now, when we're talking about bringing a therapeutic agent to market to get FDA approval, there is a very specific type of trial that the FDA wants to see. The FDA determines safety and efficacy of a drug based on its performance in phase 3 placebo-controlled randomized trials. That's not the only way to determine therapeutic efficacy, but that is the way the FDA determines it. That is the standard the FDA uses. So many folks then turn around and say, well, we must not have any of those types of trials assessing cannabis because the FDA has never approved it. Well, the reality is we have hundreds of placebo-controlled gold standard clinical trials showing that cannabis is safe and effective as well. The state of California appropriated tens of millions of dollars decades ago to establish an entire research center to do nothing but FDA-approved gold standard trials on the safety and efficacy of cannabis in patients with AIDS and HIV and multiple sclerosis and chronic pain and diabetes and a number of different patient populations. Every single one of those trials showed that herbal cannabis obtained from the federal government, probably the lowest quality cannabis that's out there, was safe and effective for patients in these gold standard trials. Why didn't the FDA review it? Because the state of California has no interest in bringing cannabis to market as a pharmaceutical drug. And so they simply publish the trials, as does the state of Colorado, as does the state of Pennsylvania, as does the state of Connecticut. Even Florida has set up a state-sponsored trial program to assess medical cannabis. Even Utah has done so. Even Kentucky has done so. So again, these trials are being done. They're out there. It's just that the results generally aren't seen by the general public. They're published in scientific journals very few people read, and they certainly aren't part of the national broader discussion surrounding cannabis. Politicians aren't citing these studies. In fact, politicians are some of the most egregious offenders because they're the ones saying that there is no research and these studies aren't out there. Now, it is true that the Schedule I classification of cannabis does make scientists' ability to conduct these trials more onerous than it ought to be. But what makes the process even more onerous isn't that cannabis is Schedule I. It's that there are separate federal rules and regulations on the books that are specific to cannabis and only to cannabis that make it more difficult than it ought to be to conduct a trial where a researcher is actually administering that cannabis product to a patient. In particular, the federal rules say that you can only use cannabis from a federally licensed source. So all of the state programs that are responsible for overseeing the manufacturing and production of state licensed cannabis products, none of those products can be tested in a FDA approved randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial because those products don't come from a federally licensed source. This restriction on research predates the passage of the Controlled Substances Act. It goes back to 1968. The CSA didn't exist till 1970. This restriction has nothing to do with the scheduling of cannabis. It is a marijuana-only restriction. Nora Volkow, the director of the NIDA, who is standing behind Trump yesterday at the press conference, several years ago, in a congressional hearing, was asked about the origin of this restriction. And she said she didn't even know where it came from. She didn't know why it existed. It had just always been there. So
All right.
Rescheduling cannabis alone isn't going to lift that restriction. There's another marijuana-only restriction that says if you're a scientist and you want to conduct a research protocol with cannabis, again, where you're administering cannabis to a patient, not an observational trial, but a clinical trial, you have to get that trial approved by the Attorney General. Not a scientist, not the head of HHS, not even the head of the NIDA, but Pam Bondi has to sign off on it. That's the law. That's federal law, and it has nothing to do with scheduling. That is a specific law pertaining to marijuana. If we want to really open the doors, not the research, but the clinical trial assessments of cannabis for therapeutic value, we need to have more funding. We need to have more federal agencies involved, and we need to change those federal rules and regulations that make doing that research so difficult. And that's not changing scheduling. That's changing specific federal statutes.
Yeah, and maybe rescheduling will encourage, I can't even get it out. Maybe, but it doesn't. So listen, everyone watching, our ask here, please. Let's stop with the hand wringing over big pharma, and let's stop with the more research, because neither of these things hold water.
Yeah, I will say this. I saw someone raise this in the comments, and it's a good point. It's a point I did mean to make. For a long time, and even today, obviously the majority of the research, and in this case, I'm using research purposely in the broadest terms possible. Mm-hmm. The majority of research does receive some level of federal funding. In fact, I read once that the NIDA subsidizes 75% of all research on controlled substances that takes place worldwide, not even just in the United States, but across the world. As long as cannabis is in Schedule 1, and as long as the federal government is holding a hostile or oppositional position toward cannabis, much of those taxpayer dollars and much of that research was biased and siphoned toward assessing potential harms. I do believe that a lot of that attitude has changed in recent years, and we've seen, particularly over the last decade, a lot more research focusing on potential benefits, but I think that change will become even more pronounced if cannabis is no longer in Schedule 1. I don't necessarily think you'll see an increase in dollars being directed toward cannabis-related research, but I think the focus of that cannabis-related research might continue to change and focus more toward assessing potential therapeutic benefits, and there might be less emphasis on searching for potential harms.
Yeah, hopefully. And we can be honest about one ease to research, though it is so niche. I absolutely know this is not what people mean, but if you are conducting clinical research and you have a laboratory, you need to have a Schedule 1 drug license right now, a Schedule 1 research license, in order to possess that marijuana for research. And if marijuana were rescheduled, then those labs would not have to get the really difficult to get Schedule 1.
No, you'd have to have a Schedule 3 license.
So that
you need to have, that laboratory needs to keep the cannabis in a safe that is bolted to the floor. That is a requirement. That restriction potentially be lifted. Like perhaps the safe doesn't need to be bolted to the floor anymore.
Whoa, Paul. I'd be asking for too much there. I don't know if the Schedule 3 licenses have to be bolted to the floor. I bet there's someone I could ask. Michelle, let us know. What else? Let's see. When we talked about this not really addressing the conflict between state and federal laws, that's going to take a much, in the real world, the way the federal government's supposed to work, prior to January, we would have said this requires an act of Congress passing a bill that removes marijuana from the Federal Controlled Substances Act altogether, thus allowing states to set their own policies without threat of federal interference. People call this descheduling, and certainly NORML has long advocated that that is the policy solution, and that rescheduling is not a policy solution to America's failed experiment with marijuana prohibition. And this is not descheduling. This is a simple change, and it's not legalizing marijuana, and it's definitely not addressing that conflict between state and federal laws, right?
No, it isn't. Again, you're correct that the only way you can harmonize state marijuana policies with federal policy is to remove cannabis from the CSA altogether. And the reason we say that is because the Controlled Substances Act exists to set uniform policies on drugs for the states. Okay? Now, this is something that I don't think the former administration understood, and it doesn't sound like the current administration understood and understands very well either, because both former President Biden and current President Trump are on record saying that they support the rights of states to make their own decisions with regard to cannabis policy. Mm-hmm. Good. We applaud them for that. We do too. But unfortunately, as long as cannabis is in the CSA, whether it's Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, that prohibits states from having the authority to set their own marijuana policies. Again, the reason for the CSA was so the federal government could say, we want all 50 states to treat these substances the way we want you to treat them. The substances where states have their own flexibility are the substances that are not classified in the schedules. So the reason Texas can regulate the production and sale of and use of alcohol, for instance, within its borders, and they can regulate alcohol in a way that's, say, very different than the way Connecticut regulates alcohol, or California, or New York, or Idaho, is because alcohol isn't in the CSA. Mm-hmm. Now, the federal government, of course, has some say with regard to alcohol policies, with regard to collecting federal taxes, with regard to interstate commerce, but it doesn't have a whole lot of say with respect to how a state wants to treat alcohol within its borders, or even how a specific county wants to treat alcohol within a particular state, which is why we have dry counties in states that otherwise allow alcohol, which is why we have certain states that regulate the potency of alcohol and say, we can't have certain alcoholic products over a certain potency. In other states, you can. Mm-hmm. We have states that say you can't have alcohol sales in grocery stores, and other states say you can. We have states that say you can't have alcohol sales in gas stations, and other states say you can. Some states say your bars have to be closed at midnight. Other states say they can be open till 4 a.m. These are all decisions that are left up to the individual states because cannabis is not Schedule 1. These states don't have that same flexibility when it comes to, say, oxycodone. California can't say we're going to regulate oxycodone in gas stations and Texas has to keep it in pharmacies. The reason states don't have that same flexibility is because oxycodone is scheduled. And as a scheduled controlled substance, the federal government says states have no flexibility. So both the Biden administration and the Trump administration didn't get the memo on this. If they support states' rights to regulate cannabis as they see fit, the answer isn't rescheduling, it's descheduling, which the former administration did with hemp. They descheduled it in 2018, which is why states crafted their own hemp regulations that all differ from one another.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I want to say a quick hello to our friends, Pot Brothers at Law, who clearly have just joined us and would like to ask this question, which I know they know the answer to. But you're late to the show, my friends. We've answered it before. We'll answer it again. No, of course not. You do not have to get a prescription for marijuana today, and you will not be getting a prescription for marijuana if it's Schedule 3.
No. Again, this should be cut and dry. People need prescriptions for FDA approved substances. Cannabis is not FDA approved now. Moving it to Schedule 3 does not equate to FDA approval. And again, both HHS and the former White House legal opinion made that point clear. One does not equate to the other. Absent FDA approval, you don't need a prescription and you don't need to obtain it in a pharmacy.
And just sort of piggybacking on that, I wanted to address this comment that rescheduling is not about THC. This is about the
plant.
THC.
Again, yes. Look at the HHS recommendation. They were clear. This is referring to botanical cannabis. In fact, synthetic THC is already Schedule 3 and has been for decades.
Yeah, 100% pure synthetic.
And I'd mentioned this too. Epidiolex, which is plant-derived CBD that is FDA approved, is not scheduled at all. Nope. It's not even in the CSA.
I see. I was trying to read Chad's comment about RICO. Read it and tell me if you want to talk about it, Paul. Yes, Brian, Marinol. Marinol is the brand name for
dronabinol.
The approved drug.
Yes, it's synthetic THC encapsulated in sesame seed oil. It was approved by the FDA in 1986, and it was descheduled due to its safety profile in, I believe, 1999. There's also a liquid form of THC that's FDA approved known as Syndrose, that I believe is also Schedule 3. And there's another THC analog that's FDA approved known as Nabilone, which is Schedule 2. And I'm not quite sure why. That seems entirely inconsistent, but that is the case. And as I mentioned, Epidiolex, which is FDA approved CBD that is plant derived, it's not a synthetic. That was initially classified as a Schedule 5 substance, and then it was removed from the CSA altogether.
And that's through what was originally GW Pharmaceuticals. I think
now it's Jazz Pharmaceuticals.
Jazz now, and that's done in the UK. That's not actually grown.
Correct, because there is no pathway for botanical cannabis drug development in the United States. That's why that drug was developed overseas.
You know, normally we don't get into this, but look, Richard, Marinol is just THC, and it's not fake. It's still the same molecule. It's not the plant, but it is still the same molecule. And unlike other, it's regulated. It's highly regulated, so you know that what you're getting has to meet FDA standards, which is different than if you're getting synthesized cannabinoids at the gas station. They're not equivalent, but you know, Marinol generally has not been super well tolerated by patients. A lot of people complain about it, again, because it is just pure THC.
Yeah, and because of its pharmacokinetics, because it's taken orally and there's delayed onset, and then there's also the way the body metabolizes oral THC is very different than the way it metabolizes smoked THC, and so there tends to be greater psychoactivity associated with it that a lot of patients don't care for.
And longer lasting.
Oh, much longer lasting, for sure.
Oh, I can't read all of that. Yeah, Frogs, I don't think Marinol is particularly popular.
No, none of those products that we mentioned are.
Oh, okay. I think this is an interesting question from OG Grandma. They say some claim this executive order favors CBD and dismisses THC.
Sure. So there was nothing in the executive order specific to CBD. The executive order was specific to the HHS recommendation from 2023 that cannabis be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And as we said just a few minutes ago, that refers to the botanical plant cannabis. CBD was discussed separately in the press conference. And clearly there were discussions from this administration that shows they are sympathetic to patients who use CBD. And in fact, that they wanted to take actions to increase patients' access to specific CBD products. That's why, again, they proposed a reimbursement program for seniors in the Medicare system who are using CBD. And that's why they also addressed the need for Congress to potentially amend the existing regulations. I'm sorry, the existing law that's set to take effect next year that could potentially limit patients' access to certain hemp-derived products. It was clear the administration is concerned that they don't want to limit patients' access to those products.
I mean, it's clear they were influenced by.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think it's a coincidence that the administration's taking this stance and that Donald Trump has a collegiate relationship with certain players in the CBD production industry.
Yeah,
I'm sure that one is certainly related to the other.
Yeah, it was. I was not surprised to see that guy standing next to him and speaking during that presser.
Yeah. Not only does he run a CBD production company, but he runs a CBD production company that specifically targets its products towards seniors.
Yeah, sure does. I guess if you can get a retweet on your video about your old people CBD, then you're probably going to be in the room when the EOS get signed. That's what we're seeing. What have we missed, Paul? I want to talk. I think we've gone pretty in depth on rescheduling. We've been talking about it for an hour now. If you have more questions about rescheduling, you got a few minutes to get them in. We're going to wrap up. But Paul, I also want to talk about the one other thing that happened this week, which is the reintroduction of the federal housing protection bill.
Sure. So as I said earlier, right now, if you are an individual living in a state where, say, marijuana is legal for medicinal purposes or it's legal for adult use, and you're in federally assisted housing, like Section 8 housing, if you are using cannabis in your residence, you can lose access to that housing. The law says, because cannabis is Schedule 1, you can't possess it or use it in federally assisted housing. So this is a bill that's been reintroduced to eliminate that restriction. It acknowledges that marijuana is legal in the majority of states, and it doesn't make any sense to throw these people out of federally assisted housing for using this state legal product. Like I said earlier in the show, it's my contention that if rescheduling goes forward and is codified, that I think these sort of federal restrictions will simply go away on their own, because the federal government won't have the legal foundation to continue to make the case that somehow users of cannabis should be discriminated against in this manner, because cannabis is no longer Schedule 1.
Here's hoping, right? I've seen this question a couple of times. What's your opinion on interstate travel with Schedule 3 cannabis?
Yeah, again, I don't think that policy is going to change. Of course, traditional FDA-approved substances that are Schedule 3 can be shipped from state to state. Mm-hmm. But we're not talking about FDA-approved cannabis. We're simply talking about moving botanical cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Again, the rules and regulations that apply to Schedule 3 drugs primarily apply to FDA-approved drugs. Absent that FDA approval, cannabis just simply isn't going to be treated the same way.
Yeah, you can get your FDA-approved THC in a little brown pill or in some liquid, but not in the weed form. Not in the weed form. Hey John, just because I see your question. This is totally off topic, but it's been popping up throughout the show. Wiz Khalifa was sentenced to prison in Romania in absentia. So he wasn't there. Apparently he smoked weed on stage in a show, they allege, and they sentenced him after the fact. And I guess the question remains, will he be extradited to Romania to serve his 9-month sentence? And John says, will Trump pardon him? I don't know. What do you think, John? Quinn, what do you think?
I think if Wiz Khalifa's people visit Trump in Mar-a-Lago enough times and make some contributions to his campaign, his likelihood of a pardon goes way up.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. You know? Whew, Paul, this has been fun, but you know, it's time for the weekend that you and I both desperately need.
Absolutely. So I do want to leave people again with sort of a reminder that despite all the headlines and brouhaha of the last 24 hours, rescheduling hasn't happened yet, and it's not necessarily a done deal. It is more likely to be a done deal now than it was 2 days ago, but this is still an ongoing process. This simply moves the process forward to the next step. But then after that, there are still several more stages of the process. And we know, because our ideological opponents have told us so, that they plan to challenge this process every single step of the way. And there is, as part of the process, an opportunity for them to legally challenge it.
Hey,
so again, for those folks who I know on some of these boards and on Twitter act like this is going to be taking effect within the next few days or weeks, that just isn't, it just isn't the case. I wish it was, but that's not the way the process works.
Chris has kind words, and Chris says, thanks for protecting us, NORML. And to Chris, I say, you're welcome. And you mentioned something that reminded me of what we were discussing earlier, about not only are prohibitionists ready to sink tons of cash into litigation around rescheduling, but they have made very vocal statements recently that they are prepared to pour millions of dollars into multiple states with ballot initiative attempts to overturn legalization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think folks need to be aware. I've said this time and time again, our opponents haven't gone away. In many ways, the victories and successes we've had over the years have galvanized them to fight back even stronger. So, you know, one of the best ways you can tell that moving cannabis out of Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, while obviously it doesn't provide us with all the changes that we desire or even need, you know how we know it's a significant step forward? Because our ideological opponents are fighting this with every ounce of fiber they have. They are not going to go down without a fight. They have said, like I said earlier, they have said that they've retained legal representation, that they will be legally challenging this order to try to defeat it. And then they also announced that they're ready to put millions of dollars behind efforts to repeal legalization in several states in 2026 by putting this issue back on the ballot. They are trying to demonstrate a posture that they're confident, but obviously they're running scared. They know that we're winning the hearts and minds of Americans. They know we're winning the cultural battle on this issue, and they can see we're winning the political battle. And this is their last gasp. This is what they're all in on, is defeating this recommendation and trying to repeal legalization in certain states in 2026. And if we can defeat them next year, I don't think they're going to have the resources available to continue to keep up this fight. And it's going to be really hard for them to go back to those who are funding them right now and ask for more resources when they've essentially spent more money than ever before and haven't succeeded.
Yeah, and we have to be able to keep up with that, Paul. We have to be able
Yes.
to continue in this fight,
And we have to take them seriously.
Yeah.
You know, they have the money and resources right now to do damage. And this isn't the time for the reform movement to rest on its laurels and say, hey, we've been victorious all along. We're not going to lose these battles, because that's why you still have the fight. And believe me, we have a fight on our hands. We're facing headwinds in 2026. And so again, to take this all the way back to the rescheduling order, this isn't a done deal. It's not a done deal until the law is codified. And there's still a lot of steps in the process, and our opponents are still fighting back. They didn't lay down and concede yesterday and say, I guess there's nothing else we can do. Cannabis is going to be rescheduled. That's not the debate we're having. Cannabis hasn't been rescheduled yet, and our opponents are fighting as best they can to assure that it doesn't get rescheduled, despite this order.
Yeah, we really do need everyone to join us in this effort to make sure NORML has the resources. NORML is not funded by special interests. We are not bankrolled by the industry. We are powered by people, and overwhelmingly by small dollar donations. If you haven't joined NORML yet, today's a great day. You can just scan that QR code. It'll take you straight to our donation page. If you can, please chip in today to help power our movement to protect the rights of responsible consumers. NORML is the only advocacy organization dedicated solely to representing the interests and protecting the rights of responsible consumers. So if you can, please help us help you, and make sure that we have the resources to fight all of these battles in all of these states and at the federal level in 2026. We are also gearing up for state legislative sessions. There's going to be a lot to do in 2026, and we need all of your help.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nearing the end of the year. Folks can take a tax deduction if they so wish to, if they donate to the NORML Foundation, or they can just donate straight to NORML. But believe me, every little bit helps. I know so many folks say, you know, I'd love to donate, but maybe it's not necessary because I don't have a whole lot to give. And I'm sure everybody else is giving NORML donations. That's just not how it works. Your donations, no matter how small, make a difference, and it keeps us going, and it provides us with the resources to continue to represent you and to continue to fight these battles and continue to push forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And like this stream that you're watching right now, follow us on whatever platform you're watching. Make sure you're following us. You might think you are, and maybe you aren't. Please go ahead and double check that. Share this with your network. Help spread the message of the work that NORML is doing to advance cannabis freedom and to protect your rights. Let's get more people in this fight with us, okay? Paul, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, JM. It's been fun.
And I'm sure we'll see you back here on Live with NORML in the new year, right?
Absolutely. But it won't be next Friday. I'm going to take a Friday afternoon off.
I hope not. All right, Paul, have a good weekend.
Take care.
All right, friends, I am going to tell you about a few upcoming events before we say goodbye for 2025. Coming up in 2026, where are we? Here we go. Coming up in 2026, you don't want to miss the Virginia Cannabis Conference. This is January 23rd through 25th. It's in Richmond, Virginia. You can get full details at virginiacannabisconference.com. Hey, Toby, do we have a QR code for that? You want to switch the QR code to the Virginia Cannabis Conference QR code? Everyone, give it up for our new show producer and NORML intern, Toby. Wherever you're looking at, it's either here or it's over my head. Thank you, Toby. Piggybacking on the Virginia Cannabis Conference is Virginia NORML's Lobby Day. This is January 26th. It's a free event. You do need to register in advance so that we can get your appointments scheduled for you with your legislators. More details at virginiacannabisconference.com. Just click on the Lobby Day button, fill out the form. You'll be good to go. And then last but certainly not least, coming up in March is the Kentucky Cannabis Conference, March 13th and 14th in Louisville. And you can get the full details for that on Kentucky NORML's website at kynormal.org. Again, that's March 13th and 14th in Louisville. Friends, thank you for making 2025 such a fantastic year for Live with NORML. We've reached thousands of you, hundreds of thousands of you, and I just like hanging out with you all on Fridays. I love answering your questions. I'm looking forward to doing more of this with you all in 2026. I hope you all have a really fantastic weekend and holiday season. I'm J.M. Pedini, the Development Director here at NORML, and I'll see you right back here in 2026. Bye-bye.